When the name Moses is spoken, most imagine the dramatic moment of the Red Sea splitting in two. A man standing with arms raised high, wind swirling, waters defying gravity. Others recall the Ten Commandments, etched into stone amid thunder and lightning, a lawgiver cloaked in divine authority. These are the images carved into collective memory, painted across stained glass windows and recited in sacred stories. Yet behind these moments lies a far deeper story, one often left untouched. The story of a man who did not start as a hero. A man who questioned himself, who ran from his past, who bore the weight of a calling he never asked for. Moses is often portrayed as larger than life, almost mythical. His life, however, was grounded in a reality filled with fear, identity struggles, rejection, and extraordinary encounters that challenged the very core of human understanding. Too often, his journey is presented in simple strokes: rescue baby, mighty prophet, lawgiver of nations. But this glosses over a truth more profound. Moses was human, deeply so. His steps were uncertain, his heart conflicted, his obedience forged in the furnace of doubt and silence. It is in this complexity that his true story begins to emerge. Not in the miracles, but in the moments in between them. Not just in his triumphs, but in his hesitation, his silence, his long years of exile. The quiet decades away from the spotlight where his character was shaped. The sleepless nights when the weight of responsibility bent his shoulders. These are the pages rarely turned. The ones that hold the fragile beauty of a soul searching for truth and purpose. What has often been passed down are the high points, the awe-inspiring spectacles. But what of the heart that trembled when called? What of the man who asked "Why me?" more than once? What of the one who doubted his own voice, who questioned whether he could speak for the divine? There is a sacred depth in those questions, one that echoes in every person who has ever felt unworthy of the task before them. Generations have heard his name and perhaps found comfort in his power. But there is also comfort in his uncertainty, in the way he argued, hesitated, even pleaded to be excused. This is the Moses history often whispers about, but rarely explores. The Moses who had to unlearn everything he was taught in order to discover who he truly was. The Moses who was formed not only by palace walls, but by desert winds. The Moses who did not walk alone into greatness, but was carried through failure, through fear, and through the silence of years. His story is not merely a tale of victory over oppression. It is a map of the soul's journey, winding and wild. It is a testament to the way the most extraordinary purposes often rise out of the most ordinary beginnings, and how destiny is not always loud. Sometimes it is a whisper in the wilderness. Why have these elements of his story remained in the shadows? Perhaps because they are uncomfortable, because they do not fit neatly into sermons or songs, because they ask us to sit with the harder truths about transformation, that it takes time, struggle, and more questions than answers. Or perhaps it is because the vulnerability of a leader makes us uneasy. But vulnerability is exactly what made Moses a vessel of such magnitude. In understanding the fuller story, one does not diminish his greatness. Instead, it enhances it. It brings the story closer to those who have stumbled, to those who feel like outsiders, to those who are still waiting for their own Red Sea to part. In seeing Moses clearly, we see ourselves more clearly too. So this is not a retelling for the sake of drama or novelty. It is an unveiling, a drawing back of the curtain on one of history's most complex spiritual journeys. One that challenges the idea of perfection. One that embraces the questions, the silences, and the raw humanity behind the mantle of prophecy. This is where we begin. Not at the peak of the mountain, but in the quiet before the climb, in the overlooked spaces, in the human story that still speaks across time. And perhaps, in doing so, we might discover not just who Moses really was, but what his story means for those still wandering, still questioning, still hoping to be chosen for something more. The birth of Moses occurred in a world gripped by fear and cruelty, where the cries of Hebrew infants echoed through a land that had grown hostile to their very existence. Egypt, once a place of refuge for the descendants of Jacob, had become a land of oppression under the rule of a Pharaoh who saw the growing population of the Israelites as a threat to his power. What had started as peaceful coexistence turned into a calculated attempt at eradication. The Pharaoh, driven by paranoia and control, issued a command that every male child born to the Hebrews was to be thrown into the Nile. It was not merely a decree of political strategy, it was an assault on a future generation, a move to crush the very hope of a people through the destruction of their sons. Into this darkness, Moses was born. His arrival into the world was not accompanied by fanfare or safety, but by the cold knowledge that his life was not expected to last beyond infancy. For his mother, hiding him became not only an act of maternal instinct, but of profound courage. Every hour he remained hidden was an act of resistance. Every whisper, every shuffled footstep, every creaking door could mean discovery, and with it, death. Yet something stirred within her that went beyond fear. There was a knowing, however fragile, that this child was marked by something greater. She could not preserve him forever in secrecy, but she could place him in the hands of Providence. The basket, woven with reeds and sealed to float on the very river meant to be his grave, became a vessel of life. It was a surrender, not to despair, but to a higher orchestration that could see beyond the limits of human protection. His sister, watching from a distance, did not witness tragedy, but the unfolding of something extraordinary. For when the basket was drawn from the water by Pharaoh's own daughter, what should have ended in loss became the beginning of purpose. The child meant to be discarded by the state was embraced by royalty. The river that had claimed countless lives instead delivered a child into the heart of the palace, responsible for so much grief. It is here, in this irony, that the fingerprints of Providence are most visible. Moses, the Hebrew child under sentence of death, was raised under the very roof of the ruler who issued the command. He was clothed in fine garments while others toiled in the mud. He learned the language and customs of the court while his people cried out under the burden of slavery. But this was not an accident. This was design. The enemy's house became the classroom. The heir to destruction became the unwitting guardian of deliverance. Pharaoh's daughter, though nameless in the text, played a critical role. Her heart softened in a moment of unexpected compassion. She saw not a Hebrew or a threat, but a child. It is easy to dismiss such a scene as a coincidence, but the detail speaks volumes. She did not look away. She did not follow the edict. She chose life when everything around her demanded allegiance to death. And in doing so, she became part of a chain of events that would alter the course of history. Moses grew up between two worlds. In one, he was a prince, shaped by the intellect and culture of Egypt. In the other, he was still a child of Israel, his blood carrying the weight of a covenant older than Pharaoh's throne. He walked palace halls that echoed with power, but within him pulsed a quiet reminder of another people, another promise. The tension between what he was told he was and what he truly was would one day come to a breaking point, but that reckoning belonged to a future chapter. For now, the story remains in the miracle of his survival. A miracle not marked by loud wonders, but by the silent courage of a mother, the watching eyes of a sister, the compassionate reach of a stranger, and the mysterious hand of destiny. His life was not spared by chance. It was preserved with purpose. The palace did not simply become his shelter. It became the very soil in which his future calling would be planted. This chapter asks a question few dare to ponder. What if the danger we flee from is the very space where purpose is planted? What if the hands we fear might one day be the ones used to lift us? The life of Moses reminds us that purpose often emerges not from safety, but from tension, not from favor, but from threat. He was a child marked for death, yet destined to bring life to a nation. The very river that should have ended his story became the beginning of a divine unfolding. And in that tension, his legacy was born. To understand the man Moses would become, one must first reckon with the silent storm that raged within him long before he ever stood before Pharaoh or led a nation to freedom. Though he was raised as an Egyptian prince, his reflection in polished bronze did not match the lineage taught to him in the corridors of the palace. His skin, his features, his language of origin, none of it belonged to the golden world he had been adopted into. He dined at royal tables, walked among scribes and warriors, spoke in the refined dialect of the elite, but deep within, he carried questions that no tutor could answer. He was not like them, and no amount of grooming or education could erase that silent knowledge. The palace gave him power, but it did not give him peace. He was dressed in silk, but the threads of his identity were tangled. Every ceremony, every lesson in Egyptian lore, every encounter with the customs of a people who worshiped gods carved from stone, drew a line between what he was taught to be and what he suspected he truly was. No scroll addressed the ache he carried. No ritual soothed the restlessness that grew louder with time. Somewhere in his heart, he knew he was not Pharaoh's kin. He was not shaped from the same mold. And this knowledge did not come with clarity, it came with conflict. As he matured, the disparity between his life and the lives of the Hebrews around him became impossible to ignore. He saw their burdens. He saw their backs bent under forced labor. He heard the cries that the palace walls could not completely muffle. And in those moments, something inside him responded, not with the indifference of nobility, but with a recognition that reached deeper than compassion. It was not pity that stirred him, it was connection. Though he lived as a son of privilege, the blood in his veins pulsed with a different rhythm, one that resonated with the oppressed. This inner split created an emotional and spiritual dissonance that no title could quiet. Living between two worlds meant belonging fully to neither. Among the Egyptians, he was a curiosity. Among the Hebrews, he was a stranger. His presence among slaves could not go unnoticed, but his association with royalty made him suspect. He was caught between who he had become and who he was born to be. That fracture widened each day, and with it came a mounting pressure that no crown or comfort could conceal. It was in this volatile emotional state that Moses walked among his people one day and witnessed a scene that would change everything. An Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. The sight ignited something buried, something long suppressed. This was not the detached concern of a diplomat. This was rage drawn from identity, from injustice, from decades of watching and staying silent. The act that followed killing the Egyptian was not simply a crime. It was an eruption. It was the moment his internal conflict broke through the surface, uncontained. He had tried to live in both worlds, but this act marked the end of that illusion. He was neither fully Egyptian nor accepted as a Hebrew. The very next day, when he attempted to intervene in a dispute between two Hebrews, he was met not with gratitude but suspicion. Who made you ruler and judge over us? Was the bitter question hurled at him. In that moment, he realized he had no people. He had no place. He had lost the trust of one world and forfeited the protection of the other. What followed was flight, not just from Pharaoh's wrath, but from himself. The exile that began as a consequence of his violent outburst became a journey into the wilderness of identity. The man who had once been draped in authority was now draped in the dust of Midian. His royal name meant nothing in the wilderness. His education held no power among shepherds. He was stripped of status, and in that stripping, the real work began. This chapter of Moses' life is often told as a brief episode, a mere prelude to his calling. But within it lies one of the most relatable struggles of the human experience, the battle between the expectations placed upon us and the truth we carry inside. Moses' divided heart is not an ancient oddity. It is mirrored in the lives of those who feel displaced, those who perform roles never meant for them, those who wear identities stitched by others' hands, while their true selves remain buried beneath. He did not yet know his purpose, but he knew he could no longer pretend. His journey forward would not begin with certainty. It would begin with emptiness. And from that emptiness, something sacred would one day be born. But for now, he walked away. From Egypt, from privilege, from the mask he had worn for too long. And in that walk, though lonely and undefined, he moved closer to truth. When Moses fled Egypt, he did not merely leave behind the physical boundaries of Pharaoh's empire. He stepped into a season of invisibility, where his past was no longer chasing him with royal fury, but his future remained stubbornly silent. He arrived in Midian not as a leader, not as a prince, not even as a man with a plan. He arrived as a fugitive, a man stripped of identity, reputation, and direction. The land he entered was dry and rugged, barren to the eye, yet fertile in its ability to strip a soul of false strength. It was here, in the wilderness, that Moses would learn the art of becoming. The contrast could not have been sharper. In Egypt, he had known wealth, structure, and power. In Midian, he knew none of these. The wilderness offered no recognition, no stages to stand on, no crowds to command. He became a shepherd, a role far removed from palace life, one that required patience, solitude, and humility. Each day was marked by routine leading flocks to pasture, guarding them from danger, living among hills that spoke no words yet whispered truths through their stillness. It was a life void of titles, but rich in something he had never truly known: dependence. The silence of the wilderness can be unsettling for those who are used to the noise of activity and affirmation. Moses had once moved through halls where every action had consequence, where eyes watched and voices praised or questioned. Now, he moved among sheep who neither knew nor cared what he once was. The ego that had been fed by the court was now starved. But in that starvation, something deeper began to take root. The man who had once acted out of anger, who killed in the name of justice, but without restraint, was now forced to face the truth that leadership is not born in acts of impulse, but in the quiet, often painful process of inner refinement. This was not punishment, though it may have felt like loss, though the days bled into years without any sign of calling or progress. It was not exile for exile's sake. It was preparation. It was the deliberate work of stripping away what would one day make room for true authority. In the palace, Moses had been taught how to command. In the wilderness, he was learning how to listen. In Egypt, he had access to information. In Midian, he was learning wisdom. He was not forgotten. Though years passed without a sign, without a voice from heaven or a clear direction forward, he was not abandoned. This is the sacred tension of formation. Nothing appears to be happening, yet everything is being transformed. The wilderness holds no public achievements to celebrate, no evidence that destiny is at work, yet it remains one of the most essential seasons in a soul's journey. For it is here that one becomes quiet enough to hear what the noise of ambition drowns out. It is here that one begins to see not through the eyes of legacy, but through the lens of surrender. In time, Moses married, became a father, and found a rhythm in the dust and wind. But even with this new life, the ache for purpose never fully disappeared. It lingered beneath the surface, waiting. He had no way of knowing that this wilderness, which seemed so far removed from the unfolding of history, was the very ground where his character was being reshaped. The man who would one day face down the might of Pharaoh was being carved in obscurity, one day at a time, by silence, patience, and long obedience. The desert did not merely test him, it transformed him. It peeled back layers he did not know he had. It forced him to confront not just what he had done, but who he was becoming. No spotlight, no recognition, no assurance that he was on the right path. And yet, in that very absence, something eternal was being built. The The roots of leadership grow deep in soil untouched by applause. Many overlook these years in Midian, thinking them wasted or uneventful. But they were the foundation. Without them, the Moses who would return to Egypt would not exist. Without the silence, he could not have recognized the voice. Without the humbling, he would have relied on his own strength. Without the years of being unseen, he could not have borne the weight of being followed. In this season, he was not performing for others. He was not trying to prove anything. He was simply present. And in that presence, the ground beneath him was preparing to burn. He just did not know it yet. It began as an ordinary day in the wilderness, a day not unlike the countless others that had passed unnoticed. Moses had come to accept the rhythm of the desert, to find meaning in its simplicity, and to live without expectation of divine interruption. Yet the divine is not always announced with thunder or foretold by signs in the sky. Sometimes it arrives in quiet mystery, cloaked in the familiar, until it suddenly reveals the extraordinary. On this day, it came as a flame and unassuming bush, ignited yet not consumed. Its fire a paradox that drew Moses near, but would not be explained by the laws of nature. What began as curiosity quickly shifted into awe as a voice spoke from the flames. Moses, the former prince and current shepherd, heard his name called not with rebuke, but with intimacy. It was not the voice of man, nor of memory, but something entirely other. And with that call came a command: remove your sandals, for the ground on which you stand is holy. The soil had not changed in composition, but in presence. The ordinary had become sacred not by its nature, but by who was now within it. This moment was not only a spectacle, it was a confrontation. Not a confrontation of accusation, but of calling. God did not begin by instructing Moses in what to do. He began by declaring who he was, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. In other words, the God who works through history, through promises, through generations. Moses was not being called into a spontaneous task, but into a continuity that stretched back through centuries. He was being summoned not merely to deliver, but to participate in a story far older and deeper than his own exile. And yet, even as the voice of the Eternal spoke, Moses trembled. He dared not look directly. Reverence mingled with fear, not just of the spectacle, but of what it demanded. When the call came to go back to Egypt and speak to Pharaoh, Moses' response was not swift obedience. It was hesitation. Who am I that I should go? The question rose not from humility alone, but from fractured identity. He was no longer the prince of Egypt, nor fully accepted as a Hebrew. He was a shepherd, removed from the stage of power for decades. The fire burned, but he could not yet see himself as worthy of standing near it. Excuse after excuse flowed from his lips. They will not believe me. I am slow of speech. I am not eloquent. Each objection revealed the scars left by years of self-doubt. He had buried ambition, had quieted the voice of calling, had accepted obscurity. Now, that obscurity was being disrupted, and it terrified him. He feared not only Pharaoh, but himself. Could he carry this task? Could he bear the weight of leading a people through oppression, toward a promise that had remained unfulfilled for generations? Then came the answer that silenced every excuse, though it was not the answer he expected. God did not reassure Moses by listing his strengths or reminding him of his upbringing. He said simply, I will be with you. The success of the mission would not rest on Moses' ability, but on presence, divine presence. And when Moses asked for a name, something to carry, something to declare, he received a revelation so profound it still echoes through centuries. I am who I am. This was not a name in the traditional sense. It was being itself, existence, constancy, the one who is, who was, and who always will be. With these words, God was not merely introducing himself. He was anchoring Moses in a truth that transcended identity crises, insecurities, and circumstances. The I Am was not a distant deity demanding action, but a living presence promising accompaniment. In this moment, the bush continued to burn, and Moses stood barefoot before the infinite. He could no longer retreat into obscurity. The call had found him. It had pierced through the years of exile, through the layers of doubt, and had reignited a purpose that would not be ignored. He was being sent, but not as the man he had once been, not as the prince who fled or the shepherd who wandered. He was being sent as one who had stood in holy ground, heard the voice of the eternal, and had been marked by fire. This encounter did not erase his fear. It did not guarantee an easy path forward, but it redefined him. He would not go in his own name or with his own strength. He would go with the name I Am, a name that needed no defense, a name that shattered the illusion of self-sufficiency and replaced it with sacred trust. Moses walked away from that bush forever changed. The desert still stretched before him, Egypt still loomed behind him, but something within had shifted. He had been seen. He had been called. And the flame that burned without consuming now burned within him, igniting a journey that would challenge empires and awaken a nation. The journey back to Egypt was not one of triumph, nor did it echo with confidence. It began not with a declaration, but with trembling steps taken in obedience rather than certainty. Moses, having encountered the divine in fire and silence, now found himself walking toward the very place he had once fled in shame and fear. Every mile between Midian and Egypt carried the weight of memory. The memories of the act that made him a fugitive, the faces he had left behind, the people he had failed to help, and the Pharaoh's house that once called him son. To return was not just to revisit a land, it was to face his past in full measure. He did not go alone. With him went the staff, a simple tool of his trade as a shepherd, yet now infused with deeper significance. What had once guided sheep through dry terrain was now the chosen instrument through which divine power would be made visible. It was not ornate or polished, not the kind of object one would associate with authority in Egypt's court. But that was precisely the point. The staff represented the transformation Moses had undergone. It was a symbol of the wilderness, of humility, of hands once empty, now entrusted with signs and wonders. As he walked, doubt was not absent. The call had not erased his humanity. The fear of rejection, the uncertainty of how his return would be received, the lingering suspicion that he was still unworthy of the task, these all accompanied him. Faith, in this moment, did not look like boldness. It looked like movement despite fear. It looked like choosing obedience over understanding, stepping into risk because the command had been given. His journey back was not fueled by personal ambition, but by surrender to a voice that had called him by name. There is a particular courage required to return to the places of old pain. Egypt was not just a political power. It was the land of trauma, of lost identity, of former failure. To walk back into that space demanded more than strength. It required healing. Moses did not yet know how his mission would unfold, nor did he have a detailed plan of how deliverance would occur. What he carried was not certainty, but a commission. That was enough to move forward. Along the way, there were signs and reassurances. His brother Aaron came out to meet him, a reunion that reconnected him with his roots and provided a human ally in the task ahead. God had not sent him into isolation. The path would be difficult, but it would not be walked alone. Aaron's voice would carry Moses' words when his own faltered, and their unity would reflect the partnership that so often undergirds true calling. When Moses finally arrived in Egypt, he was not the same man who had left. He had been reshaped in silence, refined in exile, and redefined by encounter. The court he approached was no longer his home, but his battlefield. The ruler he once called family was now a symbol of oppression to be confronted. Yet even as he stood before power, he did so with a staff in hand, not a sword. His authority came not from position, but from presence, the presence that had spoken to him in the bush and now spoke through him. Each sign performed with the staff was not a display of magic, but a declaration. It said that weakness could become strength, that the tools of obscurity could carry divine weight, that obedience mattered more than appearance. When Moses cast the staff to the ground and saw it become a serpent, or when he stretched it over waters to perform signs, it was not his hand that the people would ultimately remember, but the power that chose to move through it. Still, resistance awaited him. Pharaoh did not bend easily. The people were skeptical. The path of obedience was not met with applause, but with increased burden. Yet Moses remained, not because he was certain, but because he was sustained. The call had not promised ease. It had promised presence. This return to Egypt was more than a geographical shift. It was a spiritual pivot. It marked the moment when Moses stopped running from who he was and began walking toward who he was meant to be, not by erasing the past, but by facing it. Not through the might of the old world, but through the quiet strength forged in the wilderness. The staff he held was more than wood. It was the evidence that God equips not the already capable, but those willing to be transformed. The moment Moses stood before Pharaoh was not merely a dramatic encounter, it was a collision of worlds. On one side stood a man shaped by wilderness and burdened with divine instruction, holding a staff that represented something far greater than himself. On the other stood a ruler wrapped in golden history, revered as a god among men, surrounded by the machinery of empire and the illusion of total control. This confrontation was not simply between two individuals. It was a stage upon which authority itself was being questioned, where the claims of heaven would be declared against the presumptions of earth. When Moses declared the words, "Let my people go," it was not a plea. It was a command, spoken not from personal ambition, but on behalf of a voice that Pharaoh neither knew nor acknowledged. The request challenged not only Pharaoh's policies, but his identity. In Egypt, the Pharaoh was considered divine, the embodiment of order and strength. To command him was to shatter the very fabric of Egyptian theology. This was why Moses' words echoed with such weight. They were not asking for permission. They were announcing an end to oppression and the arrival of a justice that Pharaoh's court could not contain. Pharaoh's resistance was predictable. Power rarely surrenders easily, especially when it is built on the backs of others. His heart, already hardened by years of control and dominance, could not recognize the threat as real. He saw Moses not as a vessel of the divine, but as a nuisance, a man returned from exile with demands that had no foundation in his worldview. But God had not sent Moses to persuade with eloquence. He had sent him to stand. And in that standing, a series of confrontations unfolded that would expose the fragility of Pharaoh's power. The plagues that followed were not arbitrary punishments. Each one struck at the heart of Egypt's belief system. The Nile turned blood was not just a natural inconvenience. It was an assault on a river believed to be divine, the lifeblood of the nation. The frogs, sacred in certain rituals, became a curse when they overran the land. The insects, the diseases, the darkness, all spoke a language Egypt could understand, but not refute. These were not tricks, they were revelations. Each plague dismantled a god. Each sign unmasked the false security in idols and systems that had elevated themselves above the truth. This battle was not waged with armies or swords. It was a theological war, a spiritual reckoning. Pharaoh's resistance was not simply political, it was rooted in pride, in the refusal to yield to a power that could not be measured by wealth or might. But with each refusal, the line between human arrogance and divine patience grew thinner. Moses did not gloat with each plague. He warned, he grieved. The plagues were not celebrations of destruction. They were invitations to surrender, to recognize the limits of human control and the supremacy of divine will. In the midst of this, the people of Israel watched. They had known Pharaoh only as the hand that broke them. Now, they saw that hand falter. The signs did not just shake Egypt. They awakened hope in the hearts of a people long silenced. They began to see that their cries had been heard, that their suffering had not been in vain, and that the God of their ancestors was not a distant memory, but a present force moving on their behalf. Still, liberation did not come swiftly. Confrontation is often the prelude to freedom. The plagues escalated, not because God delighted in suffering, but because resistance requires clarity. Pharaoh's grip had to be broken, not just for the sake of Israel, but so that the world would witness that earthly thrones are not eternal. The gods of empire could not save Egypt, and its might could not prevent its unraveling. Moses, in all this, remained the reluctant prophet. His confidence did not come from within, but from the call he had answered. He did not orchestrate the plagues. He obeyed the one who did. And in doing so, he stood as a living contradiction to Pharaoh's rule. He had no army, no palace, no wealth, only a staff and a word. Yet with those, he dismantled a kingdom. "Let my people go" was more than a cry for release. It was a declaration that human beings are not property, that no empire, no matter how ancient or mighty, has the right to bind what heaven has called free. It was the beginning of a shift in the human story, where deliverance was no longer a dream but a force that could shake the foundations of power itself. As the battle between divine will and Pharaoh's resistance reached its peak, a final, devastating act stood on the horizon, an act that would not only break the grip of Egypt, but also redefine the identity of an entire people. It was a night that did not begin with shouts of deliverance, but with quiet, trembling obedience. The instructions were clear, yet heavy with implication. Every household among the Israelites was to take a lamb, unblemished and young, and offer it as a sacrifice. The blood of that lamb was to be painted on the doorposts and lintels, marking each home with a sign that would become both a shield and a declaration. This was not a ritual born out of tradition or comfort. It was born in the crucible of crisis. The command was not symbolic alone. It was urgent, direct, and immediate. For that night, a force would sweep through Egypt unlike any seen before. Not a plague to be endured, but a final act of judgment. Death itself would pass through the land, striking the firstborn of every house not marked by the blood. It was a moment where obedience was not optional, where trust in divine instruction was the only safeguard against an unstoppable consequence. Inside each home, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The lamb, once part of the flock, now became the center of salvation. Its blood, though silent, spoke louder than any protest. It declared alignment with a covenant, with a God who had remembered his people and was now acting in full measure. As the blood was applied, the air shifted, not in volume, but in weight. This was no ordinary evening. It was the prelude to liberation, carved into memory through both fear and faith. The pain of that night was not limited to the Egyptians. Even among the Israelites, hearts were heavy. The cries of Egypt would be heard across the land. The grief of parents, the collapse of certainty, the raw sound of life being taken. Yet in the homes marked by blood, there was stillness, not because they were untouched by suffering, but because they were held in mercy. The angel of death, moving with authority, passed over those marked places, not because of the strength of those inside, but because of the sign upon their doors. The significance of that night echoed far beyond the borders of Egypt. It became a turning point in the collective soul of Israel. They were no longer merely survivors of hardship. They were now a people marked by divine protection and purpose. The blood on the doorposts was not just about that single evening. It became a sign for generations, a reminder that deliverance comes through obedience, and that salvation, though given freely, always carries a cost. Each element of the ritual carried meaning. The lamb, spotless and chosen, represented innocence offered in place of judgment. The act of eating together, in haste, clothed for departure, spoke of readiness. Liberation was not an abstract hope, it was imminent. This was not a celebration. It was a solemn moment, heavy with the realization that freedom, though near, would pass through a threshold soaked in both sorrow and sacrifice. The themes of that night would one day ripple through history again. The image of a lamb whose blood shields from death would find deeper fulfillment in future generations, pointing beyond itself to a greater deliverance. But in this moment, the blood on the doorposts was enough. It stood between life and death. It stood as the boundary between the oppression that had defined their past and the promise that would define their future. What the Israelites experienced that night was not simply survival, it was transformation. They had seen the gods of Egypt fall. They had watched the might of empire falter. And now, in the stillness of night marked by shadow and light, they stood at the threshold of something new. The lamb's blood had marked their homes, but also their identity. They were no longer nameless slaves. They were the chosen, not chosen because of their power, but because they had responded to a call, had trusted the instruction, had believed that something greater was moving through their story. In the silence that followed, as Egypt wailed and the Israelites prepared to leave, a nation was being born not through politics, but through obedience and grace. The blood on the doorposts was more than an act of protection. It was the seal of a covenant, the mark of divine faithfulness in the face of overwhelming darkness. And it was only the beginning. The night they left Egypt was not quiet. The air pulsed with urgency. After generations of bondage, after the blood-stained doors, after the wail that rose from Egypt's heart, the people of Israel moved quickly, driven not by confidence, but by command. The journey began not with celebration, but with tension still thick in the air. Every step away from Egypt was a step into the unknown. Every mile further from bondage brought them closer to fear they could not yet name. Freedom had begun, but it had not yet been secured. They were many, yet untrained, free, yet fragile. With every echo of hoofbeats in the distance, they wondered if they had truly escaped. Pharaoh's pride, though wounded, was not broken. His rage, awakened by loss, turned into pursuit. And soon, the impossible came into view. The Red Sea before them, impassable and vast, and behind them, the rising dust of chariots bearing down in fury. Trapped between death and despair, the people cried out not just to Moses, but to the heavens. Fear clawed at the edges of their newfound liberty. Why had they been brought out, if only to die by the water? Moses, who had led them thus far, now stood at a precipice that no training could have prepared him for. The sea mocked their hope. The thunder of approaching wheels threatened to consume every promise. Yet, in that very place of impossibility, something holy began to stir. The pillar of cloud and fire, which had guided them, moved behind them, standing as a barrier between the vulnerable and the violent. It was not a gesture of hesitation, it was a shield. In the moment when retreat seemed inevitable, protection rose in silence. Then came the command. Stretch out your hand over the sea. Moses, holding the staff that had defied Pharaoh's court, now stood before nature itself. This was no longer about political deliverance. This was about the God who governs creation. As he obeyed, the wind began to howl not in destruction, but in division. The waters lifted, not in chaos, but in formation. A path opened, not across dry land, but through the very heart of what had once been feared. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was real, tangible. Water standing like walls, earth beneath feet that had known only chains. The people walked, not with fanfare, but with astonishment. Each step was a miracle underfoot. The sea, once a barrier, had become a bridge. The sound of the wind filled their ears. The walls of water loomed beside them, and yet they moved forward. They did not run with ease. They walked with awe, surrounded by a reality they could neither explain nor deny. The same sea that had offered no escape now cradled a passage that only heaven could craft. Behind them, the army advanced. Pharaoh's determination had not waned, and his chariots followed into the path opened by divine power. But what was a way for the faithful became a trap for the proud. As Israel reached the far side, the wind shifted. The command came again. Moses, unwavering now, stretched his hand once more. The walls collapsed, not in anger, but in justice. The sea returned to itself, and with it, the last grasp of Pharaoh's power was drowned. What remained was silence. The kind that follows deliverance. The kind that settles not just in the air, but in the soul. On the far shore, a people stood stunned by what they had just passed through. They had walked through death and lived. They had crossed what no map could chart. They had seen not just the defeat of an army, but the unveiling of a God who does not simply call people out, but carries them through. The sea had not merely been an obstacle. It had been a stage, a holy place where fear was baptized into faith, where finality gave way to freedom. This moment became a cornerstone in their identity. Not only were they no longer slaves, they were now witnesses. They had seen what the human eye cannot often behold, had experienced rescue not in theory, but in salt and wind and trembling steps. It was not their strength that had brought them through, but the presence that had gone before and stood behind. The path had not existed until they arrived. It had been created by obedience, carved out of impossibility, and sealed by the same hand that had opened it. What they carried now was not just distance from Egypt. It was the memory of a sea that parted, and a voice that said, "Go forward," when everything else said, "Turn back." The lesson was not lost. When every path seems blocked, when every solution vanishes, it is often there that the way is made. Not because one deserves it, but because the one who calls does not abandon his own in the face of overwhelming odds. The triumph of the Red Sea still echoed in the minds of the Israelites, yet the celebration was fleeting. The songs sung on the shores of deliverance faded quickly into murmurs of discontent. Freedom, while longed for and divinely granted, did not immediately bring ease or clarity. The wilderness they now wandered into was vast and unforgiving, and the hope that had burned so brightly in the moment of victory began to dim under the weight of daily discomfort. What had begun with awe soon gave way to accusation. The same people who had walked between walls of water now doubted the one who had split the sea. It is one of the great paradoxes of the human condition that miracles witnessed do not guarantee faith sustained. In Egypt, they had suffered under a tyrant, yet they now looked back with longing, recalling not the cruelty but the food, not the bondage but the familiarity. In the heat of the desert, their memories reshaped their past into something falsely comforting, and their present trials exaggerated every inconvenience. Hunger and thirst, though real, became more than physical needs. They became the lens through which every aspect of their journey was judged. Trust eroded not with catastrophe, but with discomfort. Their complaints were not subtle. They accused Moses of leading them to die in the wilderness, forgetting that it was not Moses alone who had called them out, but the God whose power they had seen again and again. Gratitude gave way to grumbling, and grumbling to open rebellion. Each new hardship became a test they did not pass. And yet, what is most striking is not their ingratitude, but the divine response to it. Where one might expect judgment, there was provision. Where discipline might have seemed appropriate, there was sustenance. Manna appeared each morning, soft like dew upon the earth, enough for the day, never in excess, never in lack. It was not gathered in barns or stored in sacks. It taught them rhythm, dependence, and trust. Every day, they were reminded that they lived not by their own strength, but by the hand that sustained them. Water flowed from rocks, not because the land offered it, but because God provided it. These acts were not just about survival. They were invitations to remember, to recognize that the one who delivered them from Egypt would not abandon them in the desert. For Moses, however, the burden grew heavier. He was not only leading a people, he was bearing the weight of their discontent. Each complaint struck him not as a political challenge, but as a personal wound. He had not chosen this path for himself. He had not asked for this responsibility. And yet, day after day, he stood between a weary people and a faithful God. His prayers became more raw, more desperate. He pleaded not just for provision, but for help, for clarity, for relief from the pressure that seemed to crush his spirit. The desert, it seemed, was testing more than the people. It was testing the leader. Moses learned that leadership is not merely about vision. It is about endurance, about standing firm when those around you sway, about trusting the promise even when the path is dry and unmarked. He had seen the glory of God in the burning bush and the power of God in the plagues. But now he saw the patience of God in daily provision and in the silence that met each complaint. The wilderness became a mirror, reflecting the hearts of a people who had been set free, but who had not yet learned how to live in freedom. They had been delivered from slavery, but slavery had not been fully delivered from them. Their bodies moved through the desert, but their minds and spirits remained tethered to the past. And until that tether was broken, until trust replaced nostalgia, the journey would continue not in a straight line, but in circles. This chapter in their story is not a detour. It is a necessary part of transformation. Faith is not proven in moments of miraculous escape, but in seasons of sustained dependence. It is one thing to cross a sea in a moment of glory. It is another to rise each morning and believe that manna will fall. The desert of complaint reveals the fragility of the human spirit, but also the unwavering faithfulness of the one who leads. Though the people grumbled, he remained. Though they forgot, he remembered. And through it all, Moses learned that sometimes the greatest miracle is not the parting of waters, but the patience of grace in the face of persistent doubt. The wilderness had not yet ended, but the people now stood before a mountain that pulsed with something entirely otherworldly. Mount Sinai did not rise like the others in the distance, remote and passive. It burned. It thundered. It drew the eyes and unsettled the soul. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath as smoke cloaked the summit and lightning split the sky. This was not the kind of divine encounter whispered in quiet corners or glimpsed in dreams. It was raw and immediate, a display that demanded reverence and evoked trembling. Israel, newly freed but still fragile in faith, gathered at the base of a mountain that blazed with presence, and they knew this was unlike anything they had ever seen. Moses had ascended mountains before, but this was no ordinary climb. As he made his way upward, he left behind a people whose fear was rapidly overtaking their curiosity. The thunder was not symbolic. The fire was not metaphorical. Every sound that echoed from the summit confirmed that they were in the presence of something holy, a reality far greater than the stories passed down from their ancestors. They had known oppression, and they had known provision, but now they were encountering authority in its purest form, and it shook them to their core. At the summit, the line between earth and heaven blurred. Moses stood not just as a representative of the people, but as a man drawn into a realm where time and space bowed to something eternal. He received not suggestions, not counsel, but commandments etched in stone, carried not by wind, but by divine hand. These were not arbitrary rules meant to bind, but words of life meant to guide. They were not crafted in a court of human reason, but born from the heart of a God who desired not just to be known, but to dwell among his people in covenant. The giving of the 10 Commandments marked a pivotal shift. The people who had once been shaped by the demands of Egyptian masters were now invited to be shaped by divine instruction. The law was not a cage. It was a framework for freedom, a blueprint for a society not built on power, but on justice, compassion, and sacred boundaries. Each commandment spoke not only to external behavior, but to the posture of the heart. Worship was to be directed toward the unseen, not the crafted. Speech was to be guarded. Life was to be honored. Rest was to be remembered. Relationship was to be marked by integrity, not convenience. Meanwhile, at the base of the mountain, the people could not bear the weight of what they witnessed. Their fear grew into pleading. They begged Moses to be their mediator, to speak with God on their behalf. They recognized their limits, not in shame, but in awe. The mountain did not invite casual approach. It demanded reverence. And yet, it also offered something profound: relationship with the divine, not from a distance, but through covenant. What was being established was not just law, but intimacy. The very God who shook the mountain also desired to dwell among them, to shape them into a people who would reflect his nature. For Moses, this moment deepened something that had begun long before. His intimacy with God was not born on the summit. It had been forged in obedience, in exile, in complaint, and in the long walk of faith. But here, it reached a new height. He did not just hear commands, he encountered presence. He was not merely a lawgiver, he became a friend of God, entrusted with revelation that would shape generations. While the mountain burned, while the thunder rolled, he stood unshaken, not because he was fearless, but because he was grounded in relationship. Mount Sinai was not a spectacle meant to impress. It was a sacred meeting place, a moment when heaven bent low to touch earth. It was here that the identity of a people was sealed. No longer just former slaves, they were now covenant bearers. No longer wanderers, they were a nation being formed not by borders, but by belief. The fire on the mountain was not meant to destroy, but to purify. The law was not meant to control, but to instruct. And the fear that filled the hearts of the people was not without purpose. It reminded them that holiness is not to be approached lightly, but with wonder and humility. The echoes of that mountain would reverberate through history. The commandments would become the moral bedrock for countless cultures. The encounter would serve as a reference point for prophets and teachers, kings and commoners. And Moses, having stood in the fire, would carry its light down the mountain, etched not only on tablets of stone, but within the depths of his being. While Moses remained on the mountain immersed in the mystery of divine encounter, the camp below was unraveling. What had been a community drawn together by shared deliverance was now splintering under the weight of waiting. Time for them became a breeding ground for anxiety. With each day that passed without Moses' return, questions multiplied, fear deepened, and the silence of heaven was mistaken for abandonment. The people who had once trembled before fire and thunder now turned to something far more familiar, far less demanding a God they could see, touch, and control. It began with a request, but it carried the weight of rebellion. The people came to Aaron not with reverence, but with restlessness. They demanded that he make them gods to go before them, because the man who brought them out of Egypt, Moses, was now an uncertain figure, lost somewhere in the fire-covered heights. Their impatience spoke volumes. Deliverance, once fresh in their memory, had become fragile. Faith, once bold at the sea, now withered in the shadow of the unknown. And Aaron, confronted with this crowd, did not resist. He collected their gold, the very earrings that had likely been plundered from Egypt, and shaped them into a form that recalled their past, a golden calf. The irony could not be more piercing. They exchanged the invisible glory of the living God for a statue forged by their own hands. The fire of Sinai still smoked in the distance, and yet they bowed before metal. The God who had split seas and shaken mountains was now replaced by a mute idol. Their actions were not merely missteps in worship, they were betrayals. They declared that the calf had brought them out of Egypt, rewriting history in a single act of idolatry. What was born from fear quickly spiraled into full-blown rebellion. Songs and dances erupted. not in celebration of truth, but in spiritual delusion. The camp descended into chaos, and the covenant that had barely been formed was now in jeopardy. High on the mountain, God saw what was unfolding. The revelation did not come with slow sadness. It came with righteous anger. The people had turned quickly, too quickly, forsaking the path laid out for them. God's words to Moses were heavy, filled with both judgment and disappointment. He threatened to consume them and start anew, to raise a new nation from Moses himself. But here, in one of the rawest moments of leadership, Moses did not yield to the offer. He did not seize the opportunity for personal legacy. He stood in the gap, heartbroken and resolute. Moses pleaded not only for mercy, but for memory. He reminded God of the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He appealed not to sentiment, but to covenant. His intercession was not a quiet prayer. It was a wrestling, a desperate appeal that blended reverence with boldness. He asked God to relent, not because the people deserved it, but because grace was their only hope. And in this moment, the God who had called him listened. Judgment was delayed, and Moses descended the mountain with tablets in hand, only to see with his own eyes the devastation that had been described. The scene that greeted him was not a misunderstanding, it was a spiritual collapse. The people were not confused, they were defiant. The sounds that had once been mistaken for celebration were now clearly the rhythms of rebellion. Moses, overwhelmed by what he saw, shattered the stone tablets. This act was not born of rage alone, it was symbolic. The covenant had been broken before it was fully received. The law that had been given in fire had been betrayed in flesh. Confronting Aaron, Moses heard excuses wrapped in absurdity. The idol had not formed itself. The rebellion had not been an accident. Yet Aaron, like so many, struggled to take responsibility. Moses did not seek vengeance, but restoration, though it would not come without consequence. He called for those who would still stand with God to separate themselves, and in the painful aftermath, judgment fell. The day ended not with joy, but with mourning. The glory of Sinai had been met with the sorrow of betrayal. And yet, even in this moment, Moses returned to the place of intercession. He climbed again, not to ask for favor, but to offer himself in exchange. "If you will not forgive their sin, blot me out of your book," he said. These were not the words of a man desperate for control. They were the words of a leader willing to lay down everything for a people who had fallen. He did not walk away from them, even when they abandoned the truth. He stood before God on their behalf, carrying the weight of their failure as though it were his own. The golden calf remains a symbol of how quickly the heart can wander, of how prone humanity is to craft gods in its own image when the true God feels distant. But it also reveals the depth of a leader's burden, the cost of standing between holiness and rebellion. Moses did not lead from a pedestal, he led from the ground, scarred by grief, shaped by grace. And in this tension between judgment and mercy, the story of a nation continued to unfold. In the aftermath of rebellion and shattered tablets, amid the weight of disappointment and the ache of broken covenant, Moses sought something deeper than reassurance. He did not ask for a clearer plan or a lighter burden. What he longed for was not clarity, but closeness. He had stood in the fire, he had heard the voice, he had received the law, and still his heart cried out for more. In one of the most vulnerable and profound moments recorded in his journey, he dared to ask, "Show me your glory." This was not a request born of arrogance. It was not curiosity or spiritual ambition. It was the plea of a man who had carried the people's failures on his shoulders, and who now yearned not for answers, but for presence. Moses was not content with signs alone. He had seen miracles, heard commands, and walked in obedience. But now he desired to know the one who had spoken from the fire, to see with his soul what no eye had fully seen. It was a hunger not for spectacle, but for intimacy. God's response was not rejection. He did not scold Moses for daring to ask. Instead, he acknowledged the depth of the request and answered it with mercy and mystery. "No one may see my face and live," came the reply, not as a denial of the relationship, but as a boundary rooted in holiness. And yet, even in this boundary, there was invitation. God would cause all his goodness to pass before Moses. He would speak his name, declare his nature, and allow Moses to glimpse a portion of what he longed for, not in fullness, but in glory, veiled by grace. Moses was hidden in the cleft of a rock, shielded by the very hand of God. And there, in that sacred shelter, the eternal passed by. It was not fire and smoke this time. It was not thunder or shaking earth. It was presence pure, radiant, overwhelming. God declared himself not only as creator or lawgiver, but as compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. The revelation was not abstract. It was deeply personal. In that moment, Moses was not merely a leader of a people. He was a man standing in communion with the divine, a soul marked by encounter. When he descended the mountain once more, carrying new tablets and a renewed covenant, his face bore the imprint of what he had seen. It shone not metaphorically, but literally with the reflected glory of the one he had met. The people saw it and drew back in fear, unable to comprehend what had occurred. Moses was not aware at first of the radiance. He had not pursued it. It was the byproduct of proximity. Communion had left a mark that no desert, no rebellion, no time could erase. This moment stands apart not because of the brilliance of the event, but because of its quiet power. In a world where strength is often measured by control and visibility, here was a man transformed by stillness, by presence, by the sheer goodness of the one he had dared to pursue. He had led through storms, stood between life and judgment, carried commandments etched by divine hand, and now he carried something even greater evidence that he had been with God. The people, still learning what it meant to follow, could not bear the radiance. Moses covered his face with a veil, not to hide the light, but to spare them from what they could not yet understand. His encounters with God were no longer for himself alone. They became a means of mediation, of standing between a holy God and a hesitant nation. He spoke with God face to face, as one speaks to a friend, and yet bore the responsibility of translating that intimacy into instruction, that light into law. This chapter of Moses' life is easily overshadowed by the grandeur of deliverance or the weight of law-giving, yet it reveals the core of his journey. At its center was not mission, but relationship. Leadership had been thrust upon him. Authority had been granted. But his deepest longing was not for power, it was for presence. The glow on his face was not a badge of rank. It was the evidence of time spent in the sacred. What this moment teaches is that proximity to the divine changes everything. Not immediately, not always visibly, but undeniably. True encounter leaves a residue, a trace of glory that does not fade easily. And though the veil may conceal it for a time, the light remains. Moses, the man of fire and law, became also the man of radiance and prayer. He showed that to lead well is to kneel first, that to speak for God is to listen long, and that the deepest transformation happens not in public victories, but in private communion. In the wake of rebellion and restoration, after the shattered covenant had been rewritten and the radiant face of Moses had descended once more into the camp, came a command that revealed the heart of the divine more clearly than thunder or fire ever could. God instructed the people to build him a dwelling place, a tabernacle, a sanctuary not fixed in one place, but designed to move with them, to reside among them in the very wilderness where their fears and failures had been laid bare. This was not merely an architectural project. It was an invitation, a declaration that the God who had formed the stars also desired to dwell among the dust of his people. The details of the tabernacle were precise, intricate, and rich with meaning. Every measurement, every material, Every color and curtain held significance. It was not left to human design or creative impulse. It was dictated from the mountain, flowing directly from the presence that had enveloped Moses. The outer court, the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies all formed layers that reflected the layers of divine access. The closer one moved toward the center. The deeper the intimacy, and the more sacred the space became. Yet even at the outer edge, the tabernacle spoke of invitation. It stood as a reminder that the transcendent had chosen to come near. The people, still bearing the memory of the golden calf, now found themselves called to participate in something holy. They gave from what they had: gold, silver, fine linen, animal skins, and precious stones. These offerings were not extracted by force. They were given freely, stirred by hearts that had begun to understand the presence is priceless. The same hands that had once formed an idol now labored to shape a sanctuary. In this way, redemption was not only declared, it was enacted. The work of building became a form of worship, and the structure itself a prophecy in fabric and frame. At the heart of the tabernacle was the Ark of the Covenant, a chest of acacia wood overlaid with gold, upon which sat the mercy seat. Between the golden cherubim, the presence of God would dwell. This was not a statue to be seen, not an image to be worshipped. It was a space empty, yet filled. The mercy seat was both a throne and a meeting place, where the invisible God would commune with a visible people. The laws, the manna, and Aaron's budding rod would rest inside, testifying to provision, authority, and covenant. Above them hovered glory. The tabernacle was a mobile reality. It did not stand on a mountaintop beyond reach. It moved with the people. When they camped, it was at the center. When they journeyed, it was dismantled, carried, and reassembled. The cloud by day and fire by night did not hover in abstraction. It settled above the tent. In this way, the tabernacle embodied a truth too easily forgotten: that God does not wait for perfection before drawing near. He enters into the camp, into the complexity of a people still learning how to believe, still prone to stumble, still echoing the cries of Egypt within their hearts. Even the priestly garments, the incense, the altars, and the sacrifices all pointed beyond themselves. They were not merely cultural or ceremonial, they were prophetic. Each act of atonement, each drop of blood, each daily ritual whispered of something greater yet to come. The tabernacle became a shadow of future redemption, a blueprint that would one day be fulfilled not in tent and temple, but in flesh and spirit. It was the beginning of something eternal expressed in temporal form. For Moses, the construction of the tabernacle marked a culmination. He had heard the voice, seen the fire, carried the law, and now oversaw the creation of a space where all of that could dwell among the people. His time in the tent of meeting, where he spoke with God as one speaks with a friend, was not reserved for spectacle, but rooted in consistent, humble communion. And through this structure, that invitation was extended to a nation still learning what it meant to be chosen. The tabernacle stood not as a fortress to keep God in, but as a bridge to bring humanity near. Its fabric walls could not contain the infinite, but they testified to the truth that intimacy is not a reward for the righteous. It is a gift offered even in the wilderness. It was proof that the God who had thundered from the mountain desired to whisper from within the camp, to dwell not above, but among, to be seen not only in glory, but in nearness. By the time the people reached the wilderness of Zin, the journey had grown long, and the weight of leadership pressed harder against Moses than ever before. The years had taken their toll. He had mediated countless disputes, carried endless complaints, and stood as the sole intercessor between a holy God and a restless people. His face had once glowed with the presence of the divine, yet now it bore the weariness of a man who had spent decades pouring himself out for those who rarely recognized the cost. Each step closer to the promised land did not bring ease. It brought escalation. The grumbling did not cease. The memory of Egypt still lingered in the hearts of those who had never known life without chains. It was in this crucible of exhaustion that another crisis emerged. The people were once again without water, and their response followed a familiar pattern. They gathered against Moses and Aaron, not with prayer or patience, but with accusation. Their words were sharp, tinged with bitterness and sarcasm. "Why did you bring us to this place? Why did you lead us from Egypt, only to let us die in this barren land?" These questions were not inquiries, they were indictments. And Moses, who had so often responded with intercession, now stood before them carrying a reservoir of frustration that had been building beneath the surface for years. He went before God, as he always had, and once again the instruction came: "Speak to the rock, and it will pour out water." It was a command rooted in trust and the demonstration of divine power through obedience rather than force. But something in Moses had shifted. The pain of unrelenting complaint, the grief of losing his sister Miriam, and the strain of standing alone in a role few could understand, all erupted in that moment. He gathered the people, and instead of speaking with calm authority, he addressed them with anger. "Hear now, you rebels. Must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then he struck the rock, not once, but twice. The water came, but so did the consequence. In that act, something sacred had been violated. It was not merely the physical action that drew divine correction, but the heart behind it. Moses, who had once fallen face down in moments of crisis, had now responded with frustration rather than faith. He had misrepresented the character of the one who had been patient, merciful, and consistent, even in the face of rebellion. His outburst suggested that the miracle came from him and Aaron, not from the hand of God. It was subtle, but significant. Leadership, especially at this level, demanded more than action. It demanded alignment with the nature of the one being represented. God's response was immediate and heartbreaking. "Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this assembly into the land I give them." The sentence fell like a stone. For all the faithfulness, for all the sacrifice, Moses would not cross into the land he had carried in his heart for so long. He would see it from a distance, but never walk its soil. It was a moment that pierced deeper than any enemy's sword. And yet, even in this judgment, there was grace. God did not remove Moses from his role. He did not abandon him in anger. The journey continued, and Moses continued to lead, continued to intercede, continued to receive divine instruction. The consequence was real, but it was not the end of intimacy. The failure did not erase the relationship. It revealed something essential, that even the greatest among us are still human, still fragile, still vulnerable to the weight of long obedience. This moment reminds us that leadership without rest breeds resentment, that serving without being refreshed leads to reaction rather than reflection. Moses' failure was not rooted in rebellion, but in fatigue. He had carried too much for too long, and in that vulnerability, he acted from impulse rather than trust. The rock, struck instead of spoken to, became a symbol not only of disobedience, but of the cost of spiritual exhaustion. Yet the water still flowed. Even in failure, the people were not left to thirst. The grace of God extended beyond the weakness of his servant. The provision did not depend on Moses' perfection. It depended on the faithfulness of the one who had called them all into the wilderness. And in that reality lies comfort that God does not require flawless vessels, only willing ones. Moses' story, marked now by both radiant glory and painful error, became all the more human. He was not disqualified from history. He was not erased from memory. Instead, he became a testament to the tension that exists in all who lead, in all who carry burdens too heavy for one person alone. And through that tension, through that heartbreak, the mercy of God continued to flow. The journey that had begun with a basket in the Nile and continued through palaces, Deserts, fire, and covenant now approached its final scene. Moses, the man who had stood face to face with God, who had led a nation out of slavery and shaped its identity through law and presence, now stood alone on the heights of Mount Nebo. From this vantage point, he could see the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It stretched out before him like a silent promise fulfilled. Yet for all that he had carried and endured, he would not enter it. He would not set foot on the soil that had drawn the footsteps of a generation. There is a tenderness in the way his story concludes. Moses was not cast aside. He was not forgotten. The judgment that had once barred his entry into the land did not erase the intimacy that marked his relationship with God on the mountain. Alone with the one he had followed through fire and silence, his life came to a close not with fanfare, but with sacred stillness. The scriptures say that God himself buried Moses, and no one knows his grave to this day. This act speaks volumes. The Creator who had called him from the burning bush now cradled him in final rest. It was not a failure's end. It was a friend's farewell. Though his feet never touched the promised land, Moses' legacy would shape it. His words, his leadership, his obedience, and even his failures would be remembered not as relics of history, but as living echoes of what it means to walk with God. He was not perfect, but he was faithful. He was not without weakness, but he was not without favor. His life was a testament to the truth that the journey, with all its wildernesses and wonders, is as sacred as the destination. His story continues through every law he delivered, every prophet who followed, every soul who dares to walk forward, even when the path is unclear. He remains not just a figure of the past, but a companion to all who know what it means to lead with trembling hands, to obey with heavy hearts, and to believe even when the promise seems distant. In the end, Moses was not defined by the land he did not enter, but by the presence he never left. And that, above all, is the true reward to have known, walked with, and been held by the one who is I am. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you something to reflect on, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future content like this. Like the video to help others find it too, and write a comment to share your thoughts. We would love to hear from you. Lastly, share this video with someone close to you, a friend or a loved one who might need encouragement today. Thank you for watching.